Oh my gosh, I am so freaking excited. Yesterday, Paizo announced Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and man, am I excited about this. So we've already been given a ton of information about the game, a lot of the rule changes. We've actually got to listen to the game being played with those new rule changes, and so we've got a ton of information for you guys about what to expect in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or really more specifically, the Pathfinder Playtest, and I'm going to kind of go over some of those details here and kind of explain what I mean. So I hope you guys are ready. Let's get started. Welcome, adventurers. What's going on, guys? My name is Cody. This is Taking 20, a channel about all things role-playing games. And of course, let's jump in and talk about the 2nd edition of Pathfinder. So if you guys don't know, Jason Bowman and Eric Mona played the very first kind of game, I guess, that was at least recorded in some fashion with the Glass Cannon podcast. So we got to listen to a lot of these new rules being implemented, and I listened to the entire 3 hours of it, and honestly I spent about 4 hours listening to the entire 3 hours of it so that I could kind of make sure that what I'm hearing was correct. And as such, we've got a ton of information. So that's where a lot of this information that I'm talking about in the video is coming from, is specifically that podcast. And if you guys want to listen to that podcast, I'm going to put a link to down in the description below where you guys can go listen to it. The Glass Cannon guys, ton of fun. Lots of laughs. I really enjoyed my time listening to it. Reminded me a lot of Saber Dice and some of the things that we do with Pruitt and Dave and Jim and all those guys. So I had a lot of fun. I think it's worth the listen, especially if you are as excited about 2nd edition as I am. So let's jump in and talk first about some of the things that we absolutely know for fact that are going to be major core mechanics jumping over from Pathfinder to Pathfinder 2nd edition. All right, guys, so let's talk about combat first. Okay, so one of the first things that really jumped right out at me is the fact that initiative, the traditional initiative system, is gone. But it's not really gone. It still works a lot in the same way. It's just had a kind of a really cool tweak done to it, in that the things that you are doing before combat starts, those are the things that are going to be affecting your initiative in combat as you jump into the action, into quote-unquote encounter mode, which of course we'll talk about here a little bit later. So as an example, in the podcast, we heard that for the most part, a lot of players are going to be using their perception instead of their just traditional initiative. So dexterous characters may not have as big of a swing on initiative as they have a lot in traditional D20 systems in the past. So a lot of those characters were making perception rolls to actually create their initiative. But because we also had a player tracking somebody, they got to use their survival roll. But they didn't really get to use their survival roll, and that's because, as our game master Jason Bowman explained, even though he was tracking and looking for things before one of the initial encounters kind of came to fruition, none of the tracks were actually there to be found anyways, so that survival didn't really give him a bonus, and he just used his perception like the rest of the party. In addition to that, we also had a character who was kind of skulking about up ahead and kind of scouting, and he got to use his stealth roll. So we could see that basically the storytelling aspect of Pathfinder looks like they're going to be taking it up a notch here. So initiative is gone. It's now replaced with other skills in its place based on what you as a character are doing before you enter into combat. Now, the next major change, this is probably the biggest change from the entire core mechanics of the game, is that they tried to take all of the confusing different types of actions and kind of just wipe the board of those. And so now, whenever you're inside of a combat, everybody is going to get 3 actions in a round, plus a potential reaction. Sound familiar, 5e players? So basically, what they wanted to do is, instead of having like what 5th edition does, where it's a move action and then it's an attack action or a dodge action, they wiped all of that away and they compounded everything into just 3 actions. So all like the swift actions from Pathfinder 1st edition, that stuff is gone. So a move, that takes an action. An attack, that takes an action. Another attack in the same round, that takes an action. So yes, at level 1, you can make 2 swings with your weapon in the same round as long as you have enough action economy, with each attack taking a little bit of a bigger penalty as the round goes on, which is something that's very similar to how 3.5 and Pathfinder work anyways, or at least how they did work. I guess now we can consider them past editions. So you are still going to get that penalty. Specifically in the game, we saw that players, after they made their first attack, their second attack came in at a -5. Though one of the players used a more finessable weapon. I think he used a dagger. So basically that allowed him to take that second attack at a -4 because it was a little bit more agile of a weapon, I guess. But this is a major, major overhaul with how the actual action economy works inside of combat. So a lot of really cool things happen with this. Another thing is that the spell casting used this same type of mechanic. So specifically, as players were casting spells, they had to look down at the different components built into their spell, right? So if the spell was both a verbal and somatic spell, that took 2 actions to cast. But the cool thing is that once we actually had a player cast a spell that took 2 different components, taking up 2 of their 3 actions, they could then follow that up with a third action where they cast another spell that took just the verbal action. So in our example specifically, we saw that they cast Acid Splash, which took both a verbal and somatic component that took up 2 actions, and then their third action they used to cast, I believe, Shield, which was just a verbal component. So they were able to cast 2 spells in 1 round. Now, another really interesting mechanic that we saw kind of use this new action economy and kind of was a pretty significant shift mechanically was that you actually had to actively use your shield as an action. So if a player came up and he attacked once, that was a move action and then an attack. If he tried to make a second attack with his final action, his third action, he didn't get a bonus from using his shield. But if instead he moved up, made an attack, 2 actions, 1 for the move, 1 for the attack, and then actively raised his shield to kind of use that to shield himself in combat, he actually got to add that bonus for him whenever, or to his AC, whenever he in turn was being attacked. Now, another major change that we're going to see here in Pathfinder 2nd Edition from Pathfinder 1st Edition, or at least in the Pathfinder playtest rules for the time being, is that CMB and CMD are gone, right? And this was a very confusing mechanic, I think, for a lot of players that played Pathfinder. And so I think that this is a great change to the overall game because this was really difficult, not just to keep up with if you've played the game long enough and you're like, I get it, but really to teach newer players that have so much to learn as they moved into Pathfinder. So CMB and CMD are no longer in the game. And speaking of CMD and CMB, another thing that we saw continuing along kind of with these actions being more simplified, more streamlined, easier to understand, but still complicated enough to be fun to kind of come up with strategy in the round, is that grapple has now been moved to simply an action, right? It's just an action with an athletics check, so no longer a CMB check. In addition to that, we saw that a lot of the additional little tweaky moves, like for instance, 5-foot step, that is gone. That's no longer a thing. It is instead now an action. And it's going to resemble a lot, especially for you 5e players out there, it's going to resemble a lot to kind of the disengage. So it's going to allow you to move without taking an attack of opportunity. So it's still in the game, but it isn't quite the same way that you got to remember, okay, how many things can I do? And I got the move and the attack, and then I got the swift, and now I've got the 5-foot step. And it was really, really complicated. So again, they're continuing to just kind of streamline and make the moves fit more into these big, easy to understand chunky boxes while still allowing a lot of flexibility in combat. As example, flanking is absolutely back here in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and then again is a +2 bonus. So that's one that I am particularly happy to see is still in combat. One of the things, not to get into an edition war, which I'm sure that's all the comments are going to be on this particular video, but one of the problems that I have with 5th edition is I think they went too far in simplification. So it appears, based off of how Paizo is trying to structure combat here, that they're looking for a really good balance, a way that, yes, Pathfinder 1st edition was very, very crunchy, and maybe they want to move away from that a little bit, but they still want to stick to the core mechanics of their game. And so that is going to allow us as players and us as game masters and dungeon masters to kind of have a little bit of the best of both worlds so that it is easier to understand, but you still feel like it's not just move up and make your attack. You still have plenty of options that you and your characters can do inside of combat or, again, encounter mode. Now, another massive change I've saw, and this again is not 100% confirmed on how they want to work it because we were unable to actually see what a natural 20 looked like, or at least listen to it during the game, but it appears that they have done a major overhaul with how crits work in Pathfinder 2nd edition, and my gut instinct is oh no, that's a D20 system, how are you messing with crits? And again, I don't know if natural 20s will even have an additional advantage. But as it stands right now in the playtest, whenever you beat something by 10 or miss something by 10, that will create either a crit or a fumble. Specifically, we saw a player attack a skeleton. So the skeleton had a 12 armor class and a player got a massive swing with a 22, and that actually allowed the player that even though they didn't roll a natural 20, that with their bonus, because they beat that AC by 10, that allowed them to have that crit on there and deal out that double damage. So that was something that was a major change that kind of really jumped out at me as I was listening along. And the same thing worked for the critical fumble. Now, the way that the critical fumble works is exactly the opposite. If you miss something by 10, then that is going to be a critical fumble. So when the players, I believe they had to make a save when they were trying to kind of go down a slope, Eric Mona's character missed his save by 10, or he missed his check by 10, and that allowed him to kind of tumble down, and that's when he took on the hampered condition. So it also looks like we're getting a hampered condition. We're getting some new conditions involved, and specifically the hampered condition just took his movement down by 5. So he had the hampered 5. His movement went from 25 down to 20 feet. And the way that Jason explained it during the game was that as soon as he took any type of magical healing or rest, then that condition, of course, would go away, as we expect it would. But something that was kind of cool there is that he missed that check by 10, and that's when he had a fumble. So big changes to kind of how the crits and fumbles work here in Pathfinder 2nd edition. So some more things to touch on for combat is that touch attacks are back. So it does look like we're going to get a few different types of ACs there. And then in addition to that, we also saw that a player tried to make a disarm check. So kind of going back to that grapple and CMB being gone, we saw that when a player made a disarm check, it was just simply an acrobatics check to disarm versus the opponent's reflex DC. And the reflex DC seemed to be, I think, reflex plus just the mod to go ahead and disarm them. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the attack proficiencies, because it does look like proficiencies have gone a little bit of an overhaul here as well. So everything that I could tell is that the attacks and even spell casting all worked off of your proficiency, which was simply level plus mod. So when you say proficiency, you probably think, hey, that sounds a lot like 5e. And I would agree that yes, it does sound a lot like 5e when they're trying to bring each individual class closer together. So whereas, you know, we might have had fighters attack better than maybe a ranger or a bard, it does look like they're trying to level that out. But unlike 5e, it doesn't look as though they're trying to bring the power level down, because 5e's proficiency really only goes from a +2 to a +6 over 20 levels. And as you guys can tell here, with a level plus mod, we're going to have a much bigger range on what those proficiencies might look like. Staying in combat, whenever we're looking at our monsters, we actually saw that when the players were fighting skeletons, that the skeletons had a monster weakness, but instead it was listed as a number. So specifically, the skeletons had a positive energy weakness 2. Now, by the way, Jason Bullman, who was running Crypt of the Everflame, if you guys don't know what Crypt of the Everflame is, it's a fantastic little module for Pathfinder, and I think you can convert it to whatever system you're running in, whether that's an older version of D&D, whether you're running in 5e, whether you're running it for the Pathfinder playtest, really whatever. I've ran this module, and it's a very, very fun module. But he was doing a conversion kind of on the fly with this. So I know that, yes, the skeletons had a positive energy weakness 2, and I'll explain what that does here in a second. But that may or may not be canon. It may or may not end up in even the playtest rules, because again, he was doing those conversions sort of on the fly as the game went along. But what we saw with the skeletons is whenever they took damage from positive energy, they didn't take double damage or anything along those lines, but instead they just took an additional 2 damage. So this was another kind of interesting change to me for the monsters. And Paizo has already said that one of the things they wanted to focus on here for monsters and for combat is that whenever you're creating monsters and whenever you're designing monsters, they wanted to make that process a little bit more simple. So I expect a lot of massive, massive changes when it comes to monsters specifically and how they function in combat. Not just with the new action economy, which I think is a really cool little tweak here, but even with some of the things like with the reactions that they're going to get, they specifically gave an example in their press release about maybe casting fire or burning hands too close to a dragon and having that dragon use its reaction to change the overall target of that initial spell. So I expect a lot of overhaul here on the monsters. And of course, as we get closer to the playtest rules being released, I expect to get a lot more information on that. And finally, the last little bit I want to talk about for combat is specifically opportunity attacks and some of the new changes that they're making to combat with the types of actions. So specifically what we saw in the playtest is that the fighter had a reaction called opportunity attack. So it's a little unclear at this point whether all classes are going to get those opportunity attacks or some of the classes are going to get opportunity attacks, or maybe some of the classes are going to get some of the opportunity attacks and everybody else is going to get this other set of opportunity attacks. That's a little unclear there, but it was really interesting to me that they specifically called out that the fighter had a reaction called opportunity attack. And then in addition to that, we also have seen some new actions. We heard leap, which took 2 actions. So we could see that they're trying to kind of change up how just I move 30 feet. They want to kind of change some of that up. And then also we saw that they had sudden charge, and this was a little bit different from the original charge where you had to move a straight line and make an attack, but specifically this lets you basically move 2 versions, make 2 movements, and then make your attack. So a lot of new little subtleties going on with combat, and I think that the overhauls are going to be mostly nice. I do have one thing that I want to talk about, maybe a little bit of a criticism that I have so far, just based off of what we saw in the first playtest. And again, guys, this is way early. But what I saw is when you make your first attack, or you make your first attack with an action, you can follow that up with another attack at that -5 penalty. So what we saw in the first playtest was if somebody missed on their first attack, it was a big whiff, and then almost all of the second attacks, I don't even know if we heard a second attack actually hit, maybe one, and a lot of them were taken, but maybe only one of them actually landed over a 3-hour game. So to me, it seemed like it was a lot of extra kind of time wasting there. I'm sure that as your character levels up, that second attack will just make more sense. And because of how they want to create, well, do you have the action economy or not? And they don't want to separate that from lower levels to higher levels. I kind of understand that a little bit, but it did seem like at level 1, which I'm assuming that the players are playing at, I don't think they actually announced it. It did seem like, you know, if they missed on their first one, they were already going to miss on their second one. So it just seemed like a lot of whiffing with that second attack at that penalty. And also the way that grapple worked is that if you make that grapple on your first attack, you make it at your regular check. If you make it with your second action, it also took that -5 penalty. So it does seem like while they've kind of streamlined the actions, at least in the lower levels, it might be a little frustrating and kind of bog the game down a little bit more than streamline it. So I'll be interested to see how it actually plays whenever I get a chance to test out the rules for myself at lower levels. Before we talk about spells and skills and how they're going to level up, we got some really cool information over there. First, we got a sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by the Alignment is Fake News shirt, because everybody knows that alignment is fake news. And so now you can go snag your own version of the Alignment is Fake News t-shirt. Don't worry, ladies, we got versions for you over there as well. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. And don't worry, grognards, all right? I know, right? Some of you guys are like, hey, alignment, it's been in the game for forever. It should always be in the game. It's how the cosmos works. We got some shirts for you as well. Check out the Grognard, proud Grognard shirt over there for you guys. Put links to those down in the description below. Great way to support the show and have a little bit of fun at the next convention or even gaming session with your friends. All right, guys, let's talk about spells. So everything that we could see so far is a lot of kind of inferring based off of what we heard inside of the initial game. And that is that it looks like spells are going to be able to level up with you in some form or fashion. And then in addition to that, it also looks like there might even be ways to power up your spells based off of how many actions you use to cast it. Specifically, I want to talk about the Cleric Heal. Now, it wasn't made clear to us whether that was a spell being cast by the Cleric or if that was a feature that the Cleric was using, but it did have some really cool effects here. So whenever the Cleric went to heal, he could either cast a heal as a touch spell where he had to basically be next to his target, put his hand on him, cast that spell to heal him. That was one action. If he wanted to use 2 actions to cast that, he could do that same spell but at a range to him, so he didn't have to be right next to his healing target. And the third thing that the Cleric could do with the Cleric Heal was that they could basically nova out all of this healing energy to everybody. Be very clear here, positive energy out to everybody. So it looks like we're getting some flexibility here in combat, which again, I think is always a positive if you are giving players options to do in combat. I think that's always, well, typically a good thing. And another thing that we noticed, by the way, since we were talking about the skeletons earlier, is that we specifically had a player do this Cleric Nova so that it healed everybody inside their party. But with Pathfinder First Edition, whenever you Nova'd off healing energy, positive energy specifically, you could either heal your friends or you could damage undead. What we saw here with our Cleric Heal doing this kind of Nova off is that it did both, and there was no save for the undead as well. So because that Cleric just went off, he healed less, but he healed everybody in his party and he did positive energy damage to those undead creatures. So we're seeing a lot of flexibility here with features and spells. And again, they mentioned several times in the game about having those spells level up with you. So either those spells are going to level up or they are going to be able to be boosted based on the amount of actions you want to put into those. And maybe it could even be both. That's really a possibility, is that it could level up. Maybe say the die levels up or the number of dice that you're throwing level up. And then in addition to that, you can use different types of actions, number of action economy, to boost those up even further. So some really interesting and unique changes to casting here. Now, something else that was really, really interesting to me about the whole crit and fumbles new system of beating it by 10 or failing it by 10 being either a crit or a fumble, and how that affects spellcasting, was that it actually allowed save spells to crit off for double damage. And by the way, I can only assume that that spells that actually make a ranged touch attack or make a spell attack would have the same rules applied to them, that if you beat an armor class by 10 or more, that you would in fact double. But specifically what we saw in our example of gameplay is that whenever a player cast Acid Splash at a skeleton, it had to make a save. It wasn't an attack roll for the player, but instead it was a save spell for the monster. And so when the skeleton went to save, it fumbled the save, which allowed that spell to crit and in fact deal double damage. Now, in addition to this, we've also had some changes with how Detect Magic and Illusion work. So what I think is a great change, I think is gonna leave a lot more room for really cool encounter design and storytelling, is that Detect Magic can now be foiled by illusionary magic. So kind of in the example that we saw, that if you're high enough level to cast Detect Magic to beat the level that the illusion magic was cast at, that in fact would allow you to figure out that it was in fact an illusion. If it was the same, I think Jason said that there was going to be a kind of a roll to see if it worked, but again, he didn't go into the specifics in the game, and he said he would have to check that himself. And then finally, if the illusion magic is higher level than your Detect Magic, then in fact that's going to foil your Detect Magic. So if you have players coming to an illusionary bridge and they cast Detect Magic on it, they're not going to be certain. I think that's going to allow a lot more fun with those illusion spells in the game, both inside of combat and just with role-playing in general. I think that's a great, great change that needed. And finally, the last piece of information that I have for you guys on spells and magic and how it works is it does look like they're going away from Starfinder, where Starfinder kind of limited and lowered the levels of spells. It looks like in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we are now going to get level 10 spells. So don't know how I feel about that yet. I'm going to kind of hold any criticisms I have for that until I actually see it played. It may work great, and they may have already done a lot of playtesting on it, and that's why they want to go that route. But again, you guys are all going to have a chance to kind of take part in that playtesting. So whenever this becomes available in August for everybody as a completely free download, we're all going to get a chance to kind of test this out and see how that works to give them feedback to make those changes. All right, and finally, let's talk a little bit about some of the more miscellaneous topics here. So it looks like everybody is going to get class feats. Now, this was specifically a word used several times throughout the game, and it was a little unclear on how they work. From what I could tell, they could just be calling what the class does as class feats, right? So class features is now class feats. Or specifically, they could be doing something where each class is getting a pool of feats to choose from, and that's going to allow that flexibility. You know, if you're a wizard, what type of casting do you want? What type of meta magics and stuff along those lines? And again, those are all traditional things that we've seen in Pathfinder First Edition, in D20 systems like Dungeons and Dragons, but may work a little bit differently here to kind of give us some more of that actual flexibility when building characters. Eric Mona actually popped in to some of a thread that was going on over on Ian World to kind of give a little bit of feedback to some of the initial reaction. And one of the things that he made very clear was that Paizo, their main focus has been and will continue to be customizing your character, right? Making the character that you want to make that does that cool thing, or those cool few things really cool and really interesting. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but it does look like class customization, character customization, that those are big issues to Paizo, and they're going to continue to focus on those things as they move into Pathfinder 2nd Edition. For skills, it also looks like we're getting a pretty significant overhaul. So what it looks like is that you can either be untrained in a skill, trained in a skill, or expert in a skill. And based off of some of the things that we heard in the stream and in the game, it does look like, and it does sound like, that those skills are going to be able to level up. So it's a little unclear on how that's going to work, but it does seem like as you level up, or as you level up your skills, you're going to be able to not just to rank up in them and make your bonuses higher, but specifically unlock additional things that you can do with those skills. Now, as an example, they said that when it came to crafting, and which apparently is going to be a kind of more significant part of the game, because they're trying to take away some of the reliance on the Christmas tree, where you have all of those slots and all of those magical trinkets and stuff like that you have to have. They want to take away some of those things and make things a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible. And so downtime activities is going to be a big part of the game. And as such, when we were talking about crafting, it looks like you could actually, as you get high enough level, you can just craft better and better weapons. The specific example we received is that weapons also, in addition to skills, kind of have a different set of tiers in them. So it looks like masterwork is gone, and now what we have is kind of poor up to normal, up to expert, up to master, up to legend. And so whereas masterwork was just a +1 to hit, not a +1 sword, right, where it was +1 to hit and +1 damage, but rather just +1 to hit, it looks like the expert weapon is now that sort of +1 to hit. Master is going to be a +2 to hit, again, not a magical weapon, and that legend is going to be that +3 to hit. So specifically what we saw in the game, or at least talked about in the game, is that if you get your crafting up to expert level, you can unlock additional things that will just allow you to craft expert weapons, just allow you to craft that kind of +1 weapon. Again, not a true +1 weapon, because it's not adding to damage, but as you guys can see, that it looks like the skills are going to rank up and continue to grow with you to unlock additional features. So really cool and interesting to see. Definitely a different direction for mechanics. And finally, guys, the news you guys all are interested in seeing, and that is classes and races. And it does look like all of the core classes and races are coming back for Pathfinder 2nd Edition with a couple of additions, and that being the Goblin is now a core and playable race right out of the gate, and the Alchemist is now a core class built right into the core game for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So it looks like Paizo is continuing to focus on giving people the options to create the characters that they want to create, and I think it is really exciting news. I'm really looking forward to Pathfinder 2nd Edition and seeing what Paizo can come up with. All right, so now's the time to pass it over to you guys in the community. I'm obviously excited. I'm really pumped up for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I want to know what you guys think. Are you excited? Are you not excited? And also let us know if you're a current Pathfinder player or if you're a current D&D 5e player or whatever, whenever you're kind of adding to the conversation. I think that that's really cool to kind of see where that perspective is coming from. If this is your first time here and you love role-playing games as much as I do, I'd love to have you subscribe. Every week I put out new videos on GM tips, player tips, tutorials, and more. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, just hit that subscribe button right down there below and come join us. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Cody, and may your games be filled with awesome memories and even better friends. I'll catch you guys next time.
Yeah.